The wind didn't whisper on the Wyoming high plains, it moaned. It snaked through the brittle pines flanking Silas Thorne's isolated ranch, rattling the warped timbers of his cabin like a beggar's bones. Inside, the silence was a physical thing, thick as dust motes dancing in the single shaft of weak afternoon sun piercing the gloom. Silas sat at the rough-hewn table, the rhythmic scrape of his whetstone along the worn Winchester's barrel the only counterpoint to the wind's dirge. Grief had carved deep canyons in his face, older than his 40 winters. He craved only the oblivion of undisturbed sleep, a reprieve from the hollow ache. Then a sound cut through the moan, not wind, not coyote, the frantic, gasping sob of a child. And a shadow, long and desperate, fell across his threshold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. The Wyoming Territory in 1877 held a particular kind of silence. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of vast, indifferent space pressing down, broken only by the wind's eternal complaint through the lodgepole pines and the occasional, lonely cry of a hawk circling high above the sagebrush sea. Silas Thorne knew this silence intimately. He'd carve his life into it after the fever took Martha, leaving him alone with the weathered bones of their homestead and the stubborn herd of longhorns that were his only tether to a future. 5 years. 5 years of the wind, the dust, the smell of wood smoke and wet earth after a rare rain, the creak of his own joints echoing louder than any human voice. The cabin, built with hope and young strength, now felt like a tomb he maintained out of habit. He kept it clean, obsessively so. A speck of mud tracked in from the perpetually muddy trail leading down to the shallow creek was an affront, a reminder of the chaos life could bring. He was cleaning the Winchester when the sound first intruded. Not the wind shifting, nor the old rooster crowing at shadows. A high, thin wail, choked off abruptly, followed by the frantic scrabbling of small boots on the porch's warped pine boards. Silas froze, the oiled rag clenched tight in his fist. His heart, a sluggish thing lately, gave a single, hard thud against his ribs. Company was as rare as rain in July out here, 20 miles from the nearest semblance of a town, Bitter Creek. Unwelcome company, especially the kind that arrived crying. He moved to the single small window beside the heavy plank door, its glass smeared with dust and grime, affording a distorted view. 2 small figures huddled on his porch like frightened jackrabbits. A boy and a girl, maybe 6 or 7, their faces pale smudges beneath caps of tangled, dark hair. They wore threadbare coats too thin for the biting wind, clutching each other. Behind them, leaning heavily against the porch post, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright, was a woman. Her face was gaunt, etched with exhaustion that went bone deep, framed by dark hair escaping a frayed kerchief. Her eyes, wide and shadowed, scanned the empty yard and the tree line beyond with a hunted animal's intensity. She wore a faded calico dress, stained dark along her left side, near the hip. Mud caked her boots and the hem of her skirt. Silas didn't move. He watched, the familiar weight of the Winchester cold in his hands. Let them pass. Let them be someone else's burden. The silence was his armor, his penance, his only solace. He saw the woman's lips move, whispering something to the children. The girl buried her face in the woman's skirt. The boy, his jaw set in a way too old for his years, stared defiantly at the cabin door, as if willing it to open. Seconds stretched. The wind whipped a strand of the woman's hair across her face. She flinched, her hand darting out to push it away, a movement sharp with fear. That's when Silas saw the tear in the fabric of her dress near her waist, darker than the surrounding mud. Not just mud. A rusty brown stain bloomed there, partially hidden by her clutching hand. A wound, fresh enough to seep. The boy pounded a small fist on the door. Once, twice. The sound was shockingly loud in the cabin's stillness. "Please, mister." His voice was thin, reedy, but held a desperate edge. "Please open up. Ma's hurt." Silas remained rooted. His knuckles were white on the rifle stock. Martha's ghost seemed to breathe beside him, a phantom warmth against the chill. "Don't," it seemed to whisper. "This silence is all we have left." The woman raised her head, her gaze finding the smudged window where Silas stood unseen. Her eyes weren't pleading, not exactly. They were resigned, yet fiercely determined. "We mean no harm," she called out, her voice low and rough, scraped raw by fear or the miles. "Just a place to rest, just for the night. They're coming." The last words were barely audible, swallowed by a gust of wind that rattled the door in its frame. But Silas heard them. "They're coming." A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold traced its way down his spine. He saw her sway, her free hand gripping the porch post tighter, her knuckles as white as his own. The boy pressed closer to her side. His small body tried to offer support. The girl whimpered again, a tiny, broken sound that seemed to hang in the air long after the wind snatched it away. Slowly, deliberately, Silas lowered the rifle. He didn't lean it against the wall. He kept it loose in his right hand, finger resting alongside the trigger guard as he moved to the door. The heavy iron latch felt cold. He hesitated, the image of the dark stain on the woman's dress vivid in his mind. They're coming. Trouble. The very thing he'd fled to this desolate corner to avoid. Trouble with children in tow. He lifted the latch. The hinges groaned a protest as he pulled the door open just wide enough to fill the space, blocking the view inside. The smell hit him first, not just the damp earth and pine resin carried on the wind, but the sharp, metallic tang of blood beneath the scent of sweat and dust. Up close, the woman's exhaustion was a physical force. Her skin was sallow, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, but her eyes, meeting his, held a spark that refused to be extinguished. Defiance, yes, but beneath it, a terrifying vulnerability. The children shrank back slightly at the sight of him, tall, broad-shouldered, his face a landscape of hard lines and grief, unsoftened by the thick, graying stubble on his jaw. He wore faded denim and a worn flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle from relentless work. He said nothing, just looked at them, his gaze impersonal, assessing. The woman swallowed hard. "Name's Clara," she said, her voice steadier now, forcing the words out. "Clara Vance. These are mine, Eli and Evie." She indicated the boy and girl with a slight nod. We've been walking. 2 days. From over near Red Gulch Way." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Red Gulch was a rough mining camp, a place notorious for hard men and harder luck. Her eyes flickered past him into the dim interior of the cabin, then back to his face, searching. "We saw your smoke. Please, just water? For the children." Silas's gaze moved past her, scanning the yard, the tree line, the muddy trail snaking down towards the creek. Empty, for now. But the woman's tension, the wound, her words, "they're coming," thrummed in the air like a plucked banjo string. He saw the boy, Eli, staring at the rifle still held loosely at Silas's side. The boy didn't look afraid of the weapon. His gaze was calculating, almost protective as he edged infinitesimally closer to his mother's injured side. Evie peeked out from behind her mother's skirt, her eyes wide and impossibly blue, fixed not on Silas, but on the chipped enamel coffee pot sitting on his cold stove, visible through the doorway. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. The wind whistled around the corner of the cabin. A horse whinnied softly from the lean-to barn. Clara Vance swayed again, her breath catching in a sharp gasp as the movement jarred her injured hip. A fresh bead of sweat traced a path through the grime on her temple. Finally, Silas spoke. His voice was rusty, disused, grating like stones tumbling together. "Water's at the pump." He didn't move aside. He jerked his head slightly towards the side of the cabin where the cast iron pump stood near a trough. Barnes yonder. A dismissal. An offer of bare minimum, impersonal shelter. Clara's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. Not relief, but the acknowledgement of a small, hard-won concession. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," he supplied flatly. Silas Thorne, a name that meant nothing to her, just as hers meant nothing but trouble to him. She nodded, her jaw tightening. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." She shifted her weight, wincing, and gently pried Evie's hand from her skirt. "Eli, take your sister. See to the pump." Her voice was firm, brooking no argument, though her eyes remained fixed on Silas, wary. Eli hesitated for only a second, his gaze darting between his mother and the imposing figure in the doorway. He took Evie's small hand. "Come on, Evie," he muttered, tugging her towards the side path. Evie went reluctantly, looking back over her shoulder, her blue eyes lingering on the cabin door, Silas still partially blocked. Clara Vance stood alone on the porch now, facing him. The fading light caught the lines of strain around her eyes, the unnatural pallor beneath the dirt. She took a shallow breath, steeling herself. "I can pay," she said, her voice dropping even lower, almost conspiratorial. Her right hand fumbled at the frayed neckline of her dress, dipping inside. She pulled out a small object, clutched tight in her fist, offering it towards him without fully opening her fingers. Not coins, something smaller, denser. The dull glint of gold caught the dying light for a fleeting second. A heavy, ornate signet ring, intricately carved with an unfamiliar crest. It looked wildly out of place against her worn, desperate poverty. "This," she whispered, the word barely audible over the wind. "Take it, for letting us rest. Just for the night. Please." Her eyes darted past him again, into the welcoming gloom of the cabin, a fleeting expression of desperate longing for shelter, for safety. Then her gaze snapped back to his, filled with a raw fear that the ring's value couldn't mask. "They won't look for us inside a place like this, not right away." Silas stared at the ring, then back at her face. The gold glint felt cold, dangerous. A signet ring. Who was she? Who were they? The stain on her dress, this hidden treasure offered as payment for a night's sanctuary. It spoke of a world of violence and secrets crashing onto his doorstep. The silence he cherished felt brittle, about to shatter. He hadn't moved. The rifle still hung heavy in his hand. The children were at the pump, the rhythmic squeak and splash loud in the tense quiet. He looked from a ring, to Clara's pleading, terrified eyes, to the darkening tree-line where unseen pursuers might already be closing in. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the smell of dust and blood and desperation thick in his nostrils. The weight of the decision pressed down, heavier than the Winchester. He shifted his grip on the rifle stock. His gaze met Clara's, holding it for a long, charged moment. Then, without a word, he stepped back. Just a fraction, just enough to widen the crack in the doorway. An invitation, silent and grudging, into the fragile sanctuary of his grief. The wind howled its disapproval as the darkness deepened, swallowing the porch. Inside, the single oil lamp on the table flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach towards the newcomers. He didn't look at the ring again. He watched the trees. The heavy door thudded shut behind Clara Vance, sealing them into the dim, close air of the cabin. The sudden absence of the wind's moan was almost as jarring as the intrusion itself. Silas Thorne stood rigid, the Winchester still held loosely at his side, the rough wood of the stock a familiar anchor against the tide of unwanted humanity flooding his space. The smell of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the coppery tang of blood intensified, overlaying the usual sense of wood smoke, dust, and loneliness. He could feel Martha's absence like a physical chill radiating from the empty rocking chair by the cold hearth. Clara leaned heavily against the wall, just inside, her breath shallow and rapid. Her eyes darted around the single room, the scrubbed table, the neatly stacked firewood, the sparse shelves, the narrow cot in the corner that was clearly Silas's, taking into stark order the profound isolation. Her gaze lingered on the cold stove, the empty coffee pot. Evie pressed against her legs, trembling, her small face buried in Clara's skirt. Eli stood slightly apart, shoulders hunched, his dark eyes wide and watchful, flickering between Silas and the shuttered window. The gold signet ring had vanished back into the hidden recesses of Clara's dress, but its unsettling presence lingered in the charged silence. "Water," Silas rasped, the words scraping his throat. He jerked his chin towards the bucket and dipper on the shelf near the stove. Not an invitation to sit, not yet, just the barest necessity. Clara nodded, a tight, economical movement. "Eli," she whispered, her voice strained. "The dipper, for your sister first." The boy moved cautiously, keeping Silas in his peripheral vision. He filled the dipper, his small hands trembling slightly, and held it out to Evie. The girl drank greedily, water trickling down her chin on her thin coat. Eli drank next, slower, his eyes never leaving Silas. When he finished, he silently refilled the dipper and held it out towards his mother. Silas watched the ritual, the simple act of drinking magnified into a tableau of desperate survival. He saw the way Clara favored her left side, the unnatural stiffness as she accepted the dipper, the faint tremor in her hand. The rusty stain on her calico dress seemed darker in the cabin's gloom. Trouble, his mind whispered again, the word echoing in the hollow space Martha had left. Yet, the sight of Evie's tear-streaked face, smudged with dirt, stirred something long buried beneath layers of grief, a phantom ache, perhaps, for the children he and Martha had never had. He set the Winchester down beside the door, the thunk loud in the stillness. He didn't lean it. He placed it carefully within easy reach. Moving to a cupboard, he pulled out a clean, if threadbare, flour sack towel and a chipped enamel basin. He filled the basin from the water bucket himself, the splash unervingly loud. He placed it on the table, then rummaged deeper, finding a small, dark bottle of carbolic solution Martha had kept for cuts. Its sharp, medicinal smell cut through the other odors. "Clean it," he said, nodding towards Clara's hip. His voice held no warmth, only a grim practicality. He pushed the towel and the bottle towards the edge of the table nearest her. Clara flinched, her hand instinctively covering the stained fabric. Her gaze met his, a flicker of shame warring with the ingrained wariness. I can manage," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Barn," Silas stated abruptly, turning his gaze away from her discomfort towards Eli and Evie. "Hayloft. Drier. Warmer." He couldn't have them underfoot. Not here in this cramped space that still felt sacred, violated. Not with their wide, frightened eyes and the scent of fear they carried. Eli's jaw tightened. "We stay with Ma." Silas didn't argue. He simply stared at the boy, the weight of his silence and his sighs filling the room. Eli held his gaze for a moment, defiance sparking in his young eyes, then looked down, scuffing his worn boot toe on the rough plank floor. Evie whimpered softly, clinging tighter to Clara. "It's all right, Eli," Clara said, her voice gaining a thread of strength. "The barn will be fine. For now." She pushed herself off the wall with visible effort. "Help your sister." She looked at Silas, a silent question in her eyes, permission to use the basin, the towel, the harsh-smelling antiseptic. He gave a curt nod, then turned his back, busying himself with the futile task of rearranging firewood already stacked with military precision near the hearth. He heard the rustle of fabric, the sharp intake of breath as Clara probed the wound, the soft splash of water in the basin. The twins shuffled towards the door, Eli guiding Evie with a protective hand on her shoulder. Silas pulled the door open for them, a blast of cold, pine-scented air rushing in. Lean-tos on the left. Mind the mare. She kicks. He pointed into the gathering dusk. The children slipped out without a word. Eli, casting one last, searching look back at his mother before the door closed. The silence returned, but it was different now, filled with the small, intimate sounds of Clara's pain and care. The wet cloth, the suppressed gasp, the clink of the bottle. Silas kept his back turned, staring at the cold ashes in the hearth. He could picture Martha moving there, humming softly, the firelight catching the auburn in her hair. Now, only the smell of blood and medicine. "Thank you," Clara whispered behind him. The words were thick with pain and exhaustion. He didn't reply. He listened to the rhythm of her breathing, the slight catch when the cloth touched the wound. "Red Gulch," he finally said, the name hanging in the air like smoke. Not a question, a statement, a pause. Then, her voice, low and rough. "A place for men who've lost everything or never had it to begin with." Another sharp intake of breath. "My husband, Jed, thought he found something," in a played-out claim. A bitter, humorless sound escaped her, almost a cough. "Found trouble instead. Men who don't take kindly to being crossed." She fell silent, the only sound the drip of water from the cloth into the basin. The unspoken words, "They killed him. They want what he took. They want us," vibrated in the stillness, heavier than any shout. Silas picked up a split log, turning it over in his hands, feeling the rough bark bite into his palm. Gold fever, greed, violence. It always came down to that, dragging innocence in its wake. Like fever had dragged Martha away. The parallels were uncomfortable, unwelcome. He heard her struggle to stand, the scrape of the chair leg on the floor. He risked a glance over his shoulder. She was leaning on the table, the stained towel clutched in one hand, the makeshift bandage beneath her dress pulled tight, but already showing a fresh, ominous seep of red through the calico. Her face was gray, beads of sweat standing out on her forehead despite the cabin's chill. The fierce determination was still there in her eyes, but it was dimmed by pain and a bone-deep weariness that spoke of miles walked. Fear endured, hope dwindling. "Needs stitching," Silas stated flatly. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, not of the needle, but of the time it would take, the vulnerability it implied. "Morning," he added gruffly. "If you last." It was harsh, but practical. Riding to Bitter Creek in the dark, through muddy trails and unfamiliar terrain, with a wounded woman and exhausted children, was inviting disaster. He'd need light and a clear head. He moved past her, ignoring her flinch, and took the basin of pink-tinged water. He opened the door and tossed the contents into the dirt yard. The cold air slapped his face, sharp and clean. He scanned the darkening landscape, the skeletal pines swaying, the muddy trail a gray ribbon fading into shadow, the barn a darker hulk against the bruised sky. Empty, for now. He set the basin down just outside the door. Inside, Clara had sunk into the single chair by the table, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. Silas rummaged again, finding a hunk of hard cheese wrapped in wax paper and some stale biscuits. He placed them on the table near her without a word. He filled a tin cup with water and set it beside the meager food. Then he took his rifle, checked the load with practiced efficiency, and leaned it against the wall beside his cot. He pulled a worn horse blanket from a chest and tossed it onto the floor near the cold hearth. "You take the cot," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. "Kids in the loft." He didn't wait for a protest or thanks. He banked the meager coals in the stove, more for the faint promise of warmth than any real heat, and lit a single oil lamp, turning the wick low. The small flame cast long, leaping shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel smaller, more confined. He then took his own bedroll from the chest, a thick, woolen blanket smelling of lanolin and horse, and laid it out on the floor near the door, positioning himself between the entrance and the room's occupants. He sat down, his back against the wall, the Winchester within easy reach on the floor beside him. Clara watched him, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. The silence stretched, filled now with the crackle of the tiny fire in the stove, the sigh of the wind outside, and the distant, muffled sound of the twins settling in the hayloft. A soft thump, a whispered exchange. Evie's voice, thin and plaintive, drifted faintly. "Eli, is the bad man gone?" Silas closed his eyes, but not to sleep, to listen, to feel the fragile, unwelcome peace of the moment. Clara shifted in the chair, a soft groan escaping her lips. He heard the rustle as she reached for the cheese, the quiet crunch of a biscuit, the simple sounds of life, of survival in his tomb of a home. He thought of the signet ring hidden away. Who did it belong to? What had Jed Van stolen that was worth killing over, worth hunting down a widow and her children across the harsh Wyoming Territory? "They're coming." The words were a cold stone in his gut. Hours crawled by. The lamp flame guttered low. Silas remained still, his senses stretched taut, attuned to every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind. Clara's breathing from the cot had deepened, but it was restless, punctuated by soft whimpers of pain. Outside, the wind rose, howling around the eaves like a banshee. Somewhere in the deep of the night, a coyote yipped, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed across the plains. Then another sound, faint at first, almost lost beneath the wind's cry. Silas's eyes snapped open. He held his breath, straining to hear. It came again, a rhythmic thudding, distant but distinct. Not coyotes, not the wind. Hooves, several sets, moving at a steady, purposeful trot along the muddy trail that led past the creek towards his homestead. They weren't galloping, not yet, but the direction was unmistakable. Coming from the east, from the direction of Red Gulch. Silas's hand closed slowly, silently, around the cold stock of the Winchester lying beside him on the floor. His gaze, sharp as flint in the near darkness, fixed on Clara's still form on the cot. She hadn't stirred, lost in a pain-filled sleep, oblivious. The hoofbeats grew louder, a deliberate, ominous drumbeat against the earth, cutting through the wind's moan. Closer. They weren't passing by. They were slowing down, right where the trail met the turnoff to his ranch gate. A cold certainty settled over him, colder than the draft seeping under the door. They're here. The hoofbeats weren't an echo of the wind anymore. They were a deliberate, rhythmic pounding against the packed earth of the trail, a sound that vibrated through the cabin floorboards and up Silas Thorne's spine. Closer, louder, slowing, right at the junction where the muddy track snaked off towards his gate. He tightened his grip on the Winchester, the cold steel a stark anchor against the sudden surge of adrenaline. His gaze, honed by years of scanning horizons for stray cattle or worse, remained fixed on Clara's sleeping form. She lay utterly still on the cot, her face pale and waxy in the guttering lamplight, the ragged rise and fall of her chest the only sign of life. Oblivious, the twins, nestled in the hayloft, were silent too, a small, terrified silence he could almost feel radiating from the barn. "They're here." He rose silently, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his worn boots sounded like a gunshot in the tense quiet. He moved to the shuttered window beside the door, easing the latch open just enough to create a narrow slit. The cold night air rushed in, sharp with pine resin and damp earth, carrying the distinct scent of horses and the faint, acrid tang of wet leather and unwashed men. Moonlight, weak and filtered by scudding clouds, silvered the muddy yard and the tops of the swaying pines. He peered out. 3 riders, silhouetted against the bruised sky where the trail met his property line. They'd stopped, horses shifting restlessly, breath pluming in the cold air. One man, larger than the others, dismounted stiffly. He walked a few paces towards the gate, a bulky shape in a long duster, his hat pulled low. He didn't call out immediately. He stood, hands on hips, surveying the dark homestead, the cabin, the barn, the corral like a predator assessing a potential kill. The other two remained mounted, figures of patient menace. Silas's jaw clenched. He knew this dance. Men like this didn't announce friendly visits in the dead of night. They came for something, or someone. The signet ring, heavy with unspoken history, seemed to burn a hole in his awareness. He glanced back at Clara. A soft moan escaped her lips, her head tossing on the thin pillow. The makeshift bandage was a dark patch against the faded calico. Fever, he thought grimly. The wound was turning. The man by the gate finally lifted his head. His voice, when it came, was a rough baritone, carrying easily on the wind despite the distance. It held no warmth, only a calculated, false amiability. "Oh, the house. Silas Thorne? That you hold up in there?" A pause. Silence answered him, thick and heavy. "Name's Rafe Coulter. Passing through from Red Gulch. Got turned around in this damnable dark. Saw your smoke earlier. Hoping for a spot by the fire? Maybe some directions come morning?" The lie was as thick as the mud on the trail. Silas didn't move, didn't breathe. Coulter. The name meant nothing, but the mention of Red Gulch was a confirmation colder than the draft. He saw the man shift, his hand moving casually towards the holster at his hip. A warning, not a draw. Yet, inside the cabin, Clara stirred. The sound of the voice, rough and unfamiliar, seemed to pierce her fevered sleep. Her eyes flew open, wide and terrified in the lamplight. She pushed herself up on one elbow, a gasp of pain tearing from her lips. Her gaze locked onto Silas's back, rigid by the window slit. Understanding flooded her face, draining what little color remained. She clutched the thin blanket to her chest, her knuckles white. Silas held up a single finger, a sharp, silencing gesture aimed at her without turning his head. "Stay quiet. Stay down." Coulter took another step forward, his boots squelching in the mud. "Thorne, heard you keep to yourself. Don't mean to trouble ya. Just me and my boys, cold and weary. We be mighty obliged." His voice hardened slightly, the false friendliness thinning. "Maybe you seen something? A woman? Traveling with two young uns? Got herself lost, maybe. Hurt. Family's worried sick back in the gulch." Clara made a small, choked sound in her throat. Silas saw her press a hand hard against her mouth, stifling it. Her eyes, huge and dark with panic, darted towards the door as if expecting it to burst open. "Ain't seen nobody," Silas called back, his voice deliberately flat, devoid of inflection. The lie felt like gravel in his mouth. He kept his eye pressed to the slit, watching Coulter's reaction. The man didn't move for a long moment. Then he spat into the mud. "That's so." Coulter's voice lost its pretense. It turned cold, edged with steel. "Funny thing. Tracks heading this way. Fresh ones. Woman's boot, small ones kid-sized. Led right to your gate, Thorne." He took another deliberate step. "Now, we ain't looking for trouble. Just want what's ours. What that thieving Vance bastard stole before he met his end. Hand over the woman and the brats, and we ride on. Simple as that." The words hung in the frigid air. Met his end. Silas felt Clara flinch, as if struck. A low whimper escaped her this time, quickly bitten off. He saw the raw agony in her eyes, the confirmation of her fear about Jed's fate. Her hand crept towards her waistband, towards the hidden pocket where the ring lay. Silas remained still. His mind raced, cold and clear despite the thudding of his heart. 3 armed men. Him, a woman bleeding out, 2 terrified children. The cabin was sturdy, but not a fortress. He had the Winchester, his old Navy Colt holstered at his hip, and maybe a shotgun in the barn unreachable now. Surrender wasn't an option. Coulter's simple as that promised nothing but violence. He thought of Eli and Evie, huddled in the hayloft. He thought of Martha, the hollow ache ward with a fierce, unfamiliar surge of protectiveness. "Tracks could be days old," Silas stated, his voice still unervingly calm. "Coyotes drag things. Wind shifts dirt. You're barking up the wrong tree, Coulter. Right on." A harsh laugh came from one of the mounted men. Coulter didn't laugh. He drew his pistol slowly, the metallic snick loud in the stillness. He didn't point it, just held it loosely at his side. "Think I'll take a look for myself, Thorne? Just to be sure. Open the door." Nice and easy. Silas's finger tightened on the Winchester's trigger. He shifted his weight slightly, bracing himself against the doorframe. Door stays shut. The finality in his voice was absolute. The standoff crackled in the freezing air. Seconds stretched like wire. Silas could hear Coulter's horse stamp impatiently. He could hear Clara's shallow, rapid breathing behind him. He could almost feel the terrified stillness emanating from a barn. Then a small sound, not from outside, from inside the cabin. A tiny, muffled sob. Silas's blood ran cold. Evie. She must have slipped out of the barn. The latch on the back door. He'd forgotten to check it after tossing the basin water. He risked a fraction of a glance away from the slit. Evie stood just inside the back door, which stood slightly ajar. She was barefoot, shivering in her thin nightdress, her face a mask of tear-streaked terror. She'd heard everything. Clara, seeing her daughter, made a desperate, aborted movement to rise, stifling another cry of pain. Her eyes met Silas's, filled with a mother's primal fear. "Ma!" Evie's voice was a thin, trembling thread in the dreadful silence. "Ma, the bad man." Outside, Coulter's head snapped up. He'd heard it. A cruel smile stretched across his shadowed face. "Well now," he drawled, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Sounds like you got company after all, Thorne. Sounds like a little lost lamb." He raised his pistol, not pointing it yet, but the threat was clear. "Open the damn door. Last the skin nice." Silas didn't look at Clara or Evie. His focus was entirely on the slit, on the three dark shapes beyond his gate. His knuckles were white on the rifle stock. The cold calculation in his mind warred with a rising tide of fury. They knew about the children now. There was no bluffing left. He took a slow, deep breath, the smell of gun oil, cold air, Clara's fever sweat, and Evie's fear mingling in his nostrils. "Get down," he hissed over his shoulder, the command low and urgent, meant for Clara and Evie both. Behind the cot. Now, Clara didn't hesitate. Gritting her teeth against the agony in her side, she rolled off the cot, landing hard on the floor with a gasp. She reached out, grabbing Evie's arm and pulling the sobbing child down beside her, huddling together in the scant shelter the cot frame provided. Clara's hand fumbled frantically at her waistband, pulling out the heavy signet ring. She pressed it into Silas's boot as he stood immobile by the door, her touch desperate, insistent. Her voice, when it came, was a raw scrape, barely audible above Evie's frightened whimpers. "Jed." He took it from Judge Hendricks's safe after they... She swallowed hard, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. Proof of the claimed jump. Hendricks orchestrated. Coulter works for him. They'll kill us all for it. Burn it all. Silas felt the cold weight of the ring against his ankle. Proof. Not just stolen trinket, but dynamite. It changed nothing about the immediate threat, but deep in the chasm they stood over. Burning was a real threat out here. He met Clara's desperate gaze for a split second, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, an understanding forged in the crucible of shared, imminent danger. He turned his face back to the slit. Coulter was walking purposefully towards the gate now, pistol held ready. The other two riders nudged their horses forward, spreading out slightly. They were done talking. "All right, Thorne," Coulter shouted, his voice losing its last veneer. "You had your chance." He raised his pistol, aiming not at the door but high, towards the roof. The shot, when it came, was a shocking, ear-splitting crack in the stillness. A splinter of wood flew from the cabin's eaves near the chimney. A warning shot. The next one wouldn't be. Evie screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure terror that echoed in the small cabin. From a barn, Eli's voice shouted, frantic, "Ma!" "Evie!" Silas braced the Winchester against his shoulder, the stock cool against his cheek. His finger rested on the trigger. The world narrowed to the slit, the dark shapes advancing, the smell of cordite sharp in the air. He saw Coulter take another step, raising his pistol again, this time aiming lower. Then movement, not from the riders, from the barn door. A small, defiant figure burst out into the moonlit yard, silhouetted against the weathered wood. Eli. He held something long and awkward in his small hands. Something Silas kept hanging on pegs just inside the barn door for varmints. The boy raised the double-barreled shotgun, pointing it shakily towards the men at the gate, his voice cracking with fear and fury. "Leave my ma alone." Coulter stopped dead. He stared at the small figure, then threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like the runt's got spunk." He didn't lower his pistol. "Put that pea shooter down, boy, before you hurt yourself." Eli stood his ground, trembling visibly but holding the heavy shotgun as best he could. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. The boy was exposed, a perfect target. Clara made a strangled sound of horror from the floor. Time seemed to fracture. Silas knew he had seconds. He could fire through the slit, try to drop Coulter before he shot Eli. But the other two riders, he saw one of them slowly drawing his own rifle from its saddle scabbard, his eyes fixed on the boy. Before Silas could act, before Coulter's cruel amusement could turn lethal, a new sound cut through the night. The rapid drumbeat of a single horse approaching at a flat-out gallop from the opposite direction, from the trail leading towards Bitter Creek. Hooves pounded the mud, frantic and close. Everyone froze. Silas at the slit, Coulter and his men at the gate, Eli standing frozen with a shotgun, Clara and Evie huddled on the floor. Heads turned towards the new sound, the unexpected intrusion. A rider, bent low over the neck of a lathered horse, burst into the edge of the moonlight, reining in hard, just yards from Coulter's group. The horse skidded in the mud, throwing up clods of earth. The rider was panting, his face pale and urgent beneath his hat. "Rafe!" The newcomer gasped, his voice tight with panic. "Rafe, it's Hendricks. He's been robbed. Cleaned out. Back at the gulch. They hit the saloon, safe an hour ago. He's raging. Want you back now. Says forget the woman. The ring ain't there no more. It's the payroll. They got the whole damn payroll." Coulter's head snapped around. The cruel amusement vanished, replaced by stunned disbelief, then dawning fury. "What? The payroll? Who? Don't know. Masked men. Rode out hard towards the pass. Hendricks says ride, Rafe. Now, every man." For a heartbeat, Coulter stood frozen, torn between the quarry before him and the catastrophe behind. His gaze swept over the dark cabin, the defiant boy with the shotgun, then locked onto the frantic messenger. The payroll. That was money. Real, immediate money. The ring, the woman, they could wait. Hendricks's rage wouldn't. He snarled, a sound of pure frustration, holstering his pistol with a vicious shove. Damn it all to hell. He whirled toward his horse. "Mount up. Move." He spared one last, venomous glare towards the cabin. "This ain't over, Thorne. You hear? We'll be back for what's owed." He swung into the saddle, yanking his horse's head around savagely. The other riders followed suit, confusion and urgency replacing their predatory focus. In a whirl of mud, shouted curses, and pounding hooves, they were gone, vanishing back down the trail towards Red Gulch as suddenly as they'd appeared, swallowed by the night and the wind. The abrupt silence was deafening. Eli slowly lowered the shotgun, his small body trembling violently. Silas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the tension draining from his shoulders like water, leaving him feeling hollow and shaky. He lowered the Winchester, his arms suddenly heavy. Clara sagged against the floorboards, a sob escaping her lips, a mix of relief and overwhelming pain. Evie crawled in her lap, crying quietly. Silas turned from the window, the lamplight revealing the stark terror slowly receding from Clara's face, replaced by the gray pallor of exhaustion and fever. Her hand still pressed against her side, the dark stains spreading visibly. He stepped towards her, the signet ring cold against his ankle. Coulter's threat, "We'll be back," echoing in his ears like the fading hoofbeats. The immediate danger had passed, diverted by a twist of fate. But the reprieve was temporary. The wound, the fever, the relentless pursuit, they hadn't vanished. They were merely delayed. He knelt beside Clara. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting his. There were no words of thanks, only a shared, bone-deep understanding of the fragility of their situation. He reached out, not for the ring, but to gently peel back the blood-soaked fabric of her dress. The wound beneath was angry, swollen, and weeping pus. The fever wasn't just a possibility, it was a raging fire. The payroll robbery had bought them time, but Clara was running out of it. The real battle, he realized with a cold dread that settled deeper than the night's chill, was just beginning, and it was being fought within the walls of his cabin, against an enemy no Winchester could stop. He needed light. He needed thread. He needed to act now. The twins watched him, wide-eyed and silent, their small world hanging by a thread as frayed as their mother's strength. The thunder of retreating hooves faded into the Wyoming night, swallowed by the wind's relentless moan. Inside the cabin, the silence was thick, charged with the aftershock of violence narrowly avoided and the pungent, cloying smell of fever sweat and fear. Silas Thorne lowered the Winchester, the weight of it suddenly immense in his trembling hands. He didn't holster it. He leaned it against the wall beside the door, within instant reach, his eyes instinctively scanning the moon-silvered yard through the slit in the shutter. "We'll be back." Coulter's promise hung in the air, colder than a draft. Clara Vance lay crumpled on the floorboards beside the cot, Evie sobbing quietly against her chest. Clara's face was the color of old ashes, her breath shallow and rapid, catching on hitches of pain. Her eyes were half open, glazed, reflecting the guttering lamplight like dark, stagnant pools. The hand pressed to her side was slick with fresh blood, the dark stain on her dress spreading like spilled ink. The signet ring, heavy and cold, pressed against Silas's ankle inside his boot. A dangerous secret now fused to his own fate. Eli stood frozen in the doorway to the back room, the shotgun dangling limply from his small hands, his earlier defiance replaced by wide-eyed terror. He stared at his mother, then at Silas, his small chest heaving. "Ma!" His voice was a cracked whisper. Silas moved. The immediate, predatory threat had receded, leaving a more insidious enemy festering within his walls. He knelt beside Clara, the rough planks digging into his knees. Gently, he peeled Evie's clutching arms away. "Eli," he said, his voice rough but surprisingly steady. "Take your sister to the loft. Now." He didn't look at the boy, his focus entirely on Clara's wound. Eli hesitated for only a second, the raw command in Silas's tone cut through his fear. He dropped the shotgun with a clatter and grabbed Evie's hand. "Come on, Evie. Ma needs quiet." He pulled the still sobbing girl towards the back door and the path to the barn, casting one last, agonized look at his mother before disappearing into the night. Silas ignored the departing children. He carefully lifted Clara, her body frighteningly light and burning hot even through her clothes, and laid her back on the cot. She moaned, her head lolling, her eyelids fluttering. He grabbed the oil lamp and brought it closer, the yellow light falling harshly on the blood-soaked fabric bunched at her hip. The smell intensified, blood, infection, the sickly sweet odor of decay. He needed light, more light, and boiling water, thread, needle, the carbolic. His movements became clipped, efficient. He stoked the embers in the stove, adding kindling and a split log, the crackle and snap unnaturally loud. He filled the battered kettle from the water bucket and slammed it onto the growing heat. From a small, carved wooden box on a high shelf, Martha's sewing box, untouched for 5 years. He retrieved a hank of coarse linen thread, a steel needle, and a pair of small, sharp scissors. The metal felt cold, familiar, yet foreign now in this grim context. He set them beside the lamp on the table. He poured water from the bucket into the enamel basin, adding a generous splash of the sharp-smelling carbolic solution. The acrid scent battled with the fever stink. He soaked a clean flour sack towel in the mixture. Taking a deep breath, steeling himself against the intimacy of the task and the dread coiling in his gut, he turned back to Clara. Her eyes opened fully as he approached with the soaked towel. Not glazed now, but burning with fever-bright intensity, fixed on his face. Fear was still there, primal and deep, but overlaid with a desperate lucidity. "Silas." Her voice was a dry rasp. "The ring. Hendricks, he had Jed shot. In the back. Over the Silver Queen claim." She gasped, a spasm of pain contorting her features. "Jed, he found the papers, the judge's signature, forged transfers, hid them before." Her hand fluttered weakly towards her waistband, where the ring had been. Proof, only proof. Her words, fragmented by pain and delirium, painted a stark picture. Judicial corruption, murder, stolen land. The signet ring wasn't just stolen. It was a key to a deadly secret, a symbol of Hendricks's power and guilt. Jed Vance hadn't just crossed dangerous men. He'd tried to expose a viper's nest, and now the vipers were hunting his family. "I know," Silas murmured, the words unfamiliar on his tongue, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than comfort. He didn't ask for more. The story could wait. Survival couldn't. He gently pulled aside the blood-soaked fabric of her dress and the makeshift bandage beneath. The wound was worse than he'd feared. The bullet had torn a ragged gash, maybe 2 inches long, high on her hip. It wasn't bleeding profusely now, but the flesh around it was swollen, an angry, fiery red streaked with livid purple. Yellow pus oozed sluggishly from the edges. The heat, radiating from it, was palpable even before he touched it. Gangrene's cruel signature was already etching its path. Clara cried out as the carbolic-soaked cloth touched the inflamed skin, a raw, animal sound that scraped Silas's nerves. She arched her back, her hands clawing at the thin blanket. "Hurts. God, it hurts." "Hold still," Silas commanded, his voice low and hard. He pinned her hip with one strong hand, feeling the tremors racking her body. With the other, he began to clean the wound, the harsh solution stinging his own nostrils. Pus and blood mingled in the basin, turning the water a foul pink. Each pass of the cloth elicited a whimper or a choked sob. He worked quickly, ruthlessly, knowing gentleness would only prolong the agony. The smell of corruption was overwhelming. Finally, the wound was as clean as he could make it. The ragged edges of torn flesh gaped obscenely in the lamplight. He threaded the needle with hands that only betrayed the slightest tremor, the coarse linen looking woefully inadequate for the task. He dipped the needle and thread into the carbolic solution. Clara's eyes were squeezed shut, tears leaking from the corners, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Silas," she whispered again, her voice thready. If I don't, the children, Eli, Evie." The unspoken plea hung in the air, more terrifying than Coulter's pistol. "Quiet," Silas ordered, the words sharper than intended. He couldn't afford her to spare, not now. He positioned himself, took a deep breath, and brought the needle point to the edge of the torn flesh. The kettle on the stove began a low, ominous whistle, adding its voice to the wind's howl and Clara's ragged breathing. The first puncture was the worst. Clara screamed, a raw, shattered sound that echoed off the cabin walls. Silas clenched his jaw, forcing his hand steady. He pulled the thread through, the coarse linen dragging against raw tissue. Stitch after agonizing stitch, he drew the angry lips of the wound together, tying off each knot with grim precision. Sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes, mingling with the smell of blood, carbolic, and sickness. Clara's screams subsided into low, continuous moans, her body trembling violently beneath his restraining hand. Her skin burned like a furnace. Time lost meaning. There was only the needle, the thread, the ragged wound, the stifling heat of the cabin, and the woman's suffering. He tied off the final knot, cut the thread, and sat back on his heels, his arms aching, his shirt plastered to his back with sweat. The wound was closed, a crude, puckered line of dark thread standing out against the inflamed, swollen flesh. It looked terrible, but it was closed. He soaked another cloth in clean, cool water from the bucket and laid it gently over the stitches. Clara flinched but didn't cry out again. Her eyes opened, unfocused, swimming with pain and fever. She looked at him, really looked at him, past the stoic mask. A flicker of something passed between them. Not gratitude, exactly, but a profound, weary acknowledgement of shared ordeal. Her hand, trembling and weak, moved slowly across the blanket, her fingers brushing the back of his rough, calloused hand where it rested near her leg. The touch was fleeting, feather-light, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Fear, trust, a desperate plea for her children's future. Silas didn't pull away. He felt the heat of her skin against his, a connection as startling as it was unwelcome, piercing the carapace of his grief. He covered her with a clean blanket, tucking it around her shoulders. The kettle's whistle had become a shrill shriek. He rose stiffly, poured boiling water into a tin mug, and crumbled a precious pinch of willow bar powder he kept for his own aches into it. He let it steep, the bitter, medicinal scent adding another layer to the cabin's oppressive atmosphere. He helped Clara lift her head enough to sip the bitter tea. She managed a few swallows before collapsing back, exhausted. Her breathing was still rapid and shallow, her skin alarmingly hot. The fever raged unabated. The stitching was done, but the battle was far from won. Infection had a deep hold. Silas banked the stove, dimmed the lamp, and dragged the horse blanket back to the floor near the door. He sat, the Winchester across his knees, listening. Not just for hoofbeats now, but for the ragged rhythm of Clara's breathing, each labored inhale a countdown against an unseen enemy. He watched her restless form in the gloom, the rise and fall of the blanket barely perceptible. The twins were silent in the barn. The wind battered the cabin. Dawn was a gray smudge creeping through the shutters when Silas heard it. Not hoofbeats, not wind, a sound from the barn, a sharp, startled cry from Evie, instantly muffled. Then Eli's voice, low and urgent, but too far away to make out words. A scuffling sound, then silence, a different kind of silence, too complete. Silas was on his feet instantly, the Winchester ready, his heart hammering. Had Coulter circled back? Sent a scout? Had an animal gotten into the barn? He glanced at Clara. She was still, lost in fevered sleep, oblivious. He moved silently to the back door, easing it open just enough to peer out. The muddy yard was empty in the weak dawn light. The barn door stood slightly ajar. No sign of the children. A fresh wave of dread, colder and sharper than any he'd felt facing Coulter, washed over him. He'd sent them to the loft for safety. Were they? He stepped out into the chill morning air, the Winchester held low, scanning the barn, the corral, the tree line. Nothing moved. The only sound was the wind and the frantic pounding of his own blood in his ears. Then, from inside the barn, a low, menacing growl rumbled through the stillness. It wasn't human. It was the deep-throated warning of a cornered animal. Silas's blood ran cold. The mare? She was usually placid. Or something else. He moved toward the barn door, every sense screaming. He pushed it open wider, the hinges groaning softly. The dim interior smelled of hay, horse, and dust. He scanned the shadows near the stalls. The mare stamped nervously in her stall, her eyes wide. But the sound hadn't come from her. His gaze swept upwards towards the hayloft. Hay was scattered near the edge. And there, near the base of the ladder leading up, partially hidden behind a stack of burlap sacks, he saw them. Eli and Evie huddled together, frozen in terror. Eli had an arm thrown protectively around his sister. Both were staring, wide-eyed, not at Silas, but into the deeper shadows beside the feed bins. Silas followed their gaze. Two eyes gleamed back from the darkness, low to the ground. Yellow, unblinking eyes filled with feral hunger. A gaunt, gray shape detached itself from the shadows. A massive timber wolf, its ribs visible beneath its mangy coat, its lips peeled back in a silent snarl, revealing yellowed fangs. It had likely been drawn by the scent of blood, Clara's blood, carried on the children's clothes or the night air. It took a slow, deliberate step towards the twins, its growl deepening into a predatory rumble that vibrated in the dusty air. It hadn't attacked yet. It was sizing up its prey, driven by desperation and the overwhelming scent of vulnerability. Silas raised the Winchester, his finger finding the trigger. But the angle was bad. The twins were directly in his line of fire. The wolf was between them and the ladder. One wrong move, one startled leap from the beast, and the children would be torn apart before he could fire a second shot. He couldn't shout, couldn't risk startling it into attacking. He stood frozen in the barn doorway, the cold morning air biting his face, the Winchester heavy in his hands. The wolf's yellow eyes locked onto his. It lowered its head, its growl intensifying, a promise of violence in the tense silence. Eli clutched Evie tighter, a small, choked whimper escaping the girl. Silas's mind raced, cold and clear. Coulter's return was a distant thunder. This was the lightning strike here and now. He had one shot, one chance, and the twins' terrified eyes reflected the terrifying truth. The wilderness held more than one kind of hunter, and death had just crept silently into his barn. The timber wolf's growl vibrated through the dusty stillness of the barn, a sound older than fear, primal and suffocating. Silas Thorne stood frozen in the doorway, the Winchester heavy and useless in his hands. Eli and Evie were statues of terror behind the burlap sacks, the wolf a gaunt, gray ghost of hunger between them and the ladder, its yellow eyes locked on his Silas, challenging. One shot, one chance, and the children were directly in the line of fire. The wolf coiled like a spring. The smell of hay, horse sweat, and the faint, lingering metallic tang of Clara's blood filled Silas's nostrils, mingling with the wolf's feral musk. Move! Distracted. The thought sliced through the paralyzing dread. He couldn't shout, couldn't charge. He needed the beast's focus off the twins, just for a second. His gaze darted past the wolf's lowered head, past the terrified children, landing on a loose pile of hay near the loft's edge, directly above the feed bins where the wolf had emerged. Slowly, infinitesimally, Silas shifted his weight onto his left foot. The floorboard beneath his right boot groaned, a soft, protesting sigh. The wolf's ears flattened, its growl deepening, hackles rising like gray knives along its spine. Its focus remained split. The threat at the door, the vulnerable prey behind the sacks. Silas moved his right foot again, deliberately scuffing the worn leather against the gritty floor. Louder. The wolf's head snapped fractionally towards the sound, its lip curling higher. Now, with every ounce of strength and coordination honed by years of ranch work, Silas kicked out hard with his left foot, sending a clump of dried mud and straw skittering across the floor towards the wolf's flank. It wasn't much, but it was sudden, unexpected movement. The wolf flinched, twisting its head sharply towards the skittering debris. Its predatory focus momentarily fractured. Its body turned slightly, exposing its shoulder. It was the opening Silas needed, the only one he'd get. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder in one fluid motion, the cold stock pressing against his cheekbone. He didn't aim for the head, too risky with the children so close. He centered the sights on the wolf's exposed shoulder, just behind the foreleg, aiming to shatter bone and drop it instantly. He exhaled a silent puff of air in the frigid barn and squeezed the trigger. The report was deafening in the confined space. The mare screamed and reared in her stall. The wolf jerked violently as if struck by an invisible hammer, a high-pitched yelp tearing from its throat. It crumpled sideways, legs scrabbling uselessly in the dirt, a dark stain blossoming on its gray fur. It tried to rise, snarling, but its front leg was shattered. Silas was already moving, striding forward, the Winchester leveled. He stopped a few feet away, the muzzle unwavering. The wolf met his gaze, pain and fury warring in its yellow eyes. Then, with a final guttural whine, its head thudded to the floor, its sides heaving once, twice, before falling still. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the mare's panicked snorting and Evie's muffled sobs. Silas lowered the rifle, his hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. He kicked the wolf's carcass away from the sacks. "Out," he ordered Eli, his voice rough but devoid of anger. "Now, to the cabin." Eli didn't need telling twice. He scrambled up, pulling a trembling Evie with him. They stumbled past Silas, not looking back at the dead animal, their small faces pale with shock. Silas watched them flee towards the cabin door, then turned and dragged the wolf's body out into the gray dawn light, leaving it near the woodpile. The cold air felt clean after the barn's cloying fear, but the reprieve was brief. Clara, Coulter, the ring. The weight descended again, heavier than the dead wolf. He found the twins huddled just inside the cabin door, shivering. Clara lay on the cot, still as death, her breathing a shallow, rapid flutter. Silas checked her forehead, still burning, but the willow bark tea, had it done anything? He stoked the stove, adding more wood, needing heat, needing action. He filled the kettle again. "Eli," he said, not looking at the boy. "Tend the fire. Keep it hot." It was a task, something to focus the boy's terror. "Evie, wet this cloth." He handed her a clean rag. "Cool water. For your ma's head." The children moved numbly, but they moved. Eli fed small sticks into the stove with trembling hands. Evie dipped the cloth in the water bucket, her tears dripping into the basin, and carefully laid it on Claire's forehead. Silas watched them for a moment, a strange tightness in his chest. They weren't his, but they were here, and they needed him. He refilled the tin mug with boiling water and another precious pinch of willow bark powder, stirring it grimly. He knelt beside Clara again, lifting her head gently. "Drink," he murmured. Her eyelids fluttered, her lips parted slightly. He trickled the bitter liquid between them. She swallowed reflexively, once, twice, before turning her head away with a weak groan. But she'd taken some. He laid her back down, repositioning the cool cloth Evie offered. He checked the bandage over the stitches. No fresh blood seeped through. The angry red swelling seemed, not less perhaps, but no worse. A fragile stalemate. The morning wore on, gray and tense. Silas moved between the shuttered window, scanning the empty trail and Clara's side. He cleaned the Winchester again, the familiar ritual calming his nerves. He forced broth down Clara's throat, spoonful by painstaking spoonful. Eli and Evie, exhausted by terror and vigil, curled together on the horse blanket near the stove, eventually falling into a fitful sleep. The silence returned, but it was different now. Filled with the crackle of the fire, Clara's labored breathing, and the quiet presence of the sleeping children. It wasn't the silence of absence anymore. It was the silence of waiting, of shared endurance. Around midday, the fever broke. Silas felt it first as a change in the air around her, a lessening of the oppressive heat radiating from her skin. He placed his palm on her forehead again, still warm, but damp now with sweat instead of burning dry. Her breathing deepened, losing its frantic edge, settling into a slower, more natural rhythm. Her face, though still pale and drawn, lost the waxy, deathly cast. He was checking the bandage again when her eyes opened. Truly opened, clear of the fever glaze, focusing slowly on his face as he leaned over her. There was confusion at first, then a dawning awareness, followed by a wave of profound exhaustion. Her gaze drifted past him, searching the room, landing on the huddled forms of Eli and Evie asleep by the stove. A soft sigh escaped her, a release of unbearable tension. Her eyes found Silas again. No words came. Her hand, resting on the blanket, moved weakly. Not towards him, but her fingers uncurled slightly, palm upturned. An offering, an acknowledgement, a silent thank you that resonated deeper than any speech. Silas didn't take her hand, but he gave a single, slow nod, meeting her gaze. The unspoken understanding between them deepened, forged in blood, fever, and shared defense against the wolves, both four-legged and two-legged. He adjusted the blanket over her shoulders, a small, practical gesture that felt strangely intimate in the quiet cabin. The tension didn't vanish. Coulter's threat still hung over them like smoke. Silas kept the Winchester close. He thought about the signet ring, heavy in his pocket now. Proof. Dynamite. He thought about riding to Bitter Creek, finding the sheriff, telling the tale. But the sheriff was a day's ride, and Hendrix's reach might be long. He thought about burying it deep. But Jed Vance deserved more than that. Clara deserved justice, not just survival. He was pondering this, the ring a cold weight in his hand as he stood by the window, when a new sound broke the afternoon stillness. Not hoofbeats from the east, but from the west. A single rider, approaching a steady trot along the trail from Bitter Creek. Silas tensed, raising the Winchester, finger near the trigger. He recognized the horse, a sturdy bay gelding belonging to Old Man Henderson, whose spread lay a few miles further down the creek. Henderson himself, grizzled and bent but sharp-eyed, reined in near the porch. Silas opened the door, just a crack, the Winchester visible. Henderson. Thorne. Henderson nodded, his gaze taking in Silas's guarded stance, the shuttered windows. Heard some commotion last night? Gunshot. Silas grunted noncommittally. Wolf. Got into the barn. Henderson spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. Nasty business. Glad you got it. He paused, his eyes sharpening. Heard other news coming through from Red Gulch. Big news. That Judge Hendrix got his comeuppance. Silas froze. Ow! Seems that payroll robbery turned out messy. Coulter and his boys chased him, got ambushed near Rattlesnake Pass. Lead flew thick. Coulter's dead. So's most of his crew. Henderson shook his head. But the robbers got away clean, payroll and all. Town's in an uproar. Then, well, this morning, seems like Hendrix panicked. Tried to light out himself. Stage got held up just outside the gulch. Masked men again. Took Hendrix's strongbox and him. Found his body dumped a mile off the trail later. Bullet in the back. Same way he'd done others, folks say. Henderson met Silas's eyes. Poetic justice, some call it. Places crawling with Pinkertons now, as skin questions. Messy business. But Hendrix, he's done. The news landed like a physical blow. Relief, profound and dizzying, warred with a dark satisfaction. Hendrix dead. Coulter dead. The viper's nest scattered. Silas glanced back into the cabin. Clara's eyes were open, fixed on the doorway, having heard every word. A single tear traced a path down her temple, disappearing into her hairline. Not grief for Hendrix, but release. A burden lifting. Obliged, Henderson, Silas said, his voice tight. Figured you'd want to know, Henderson said, gathering his reins. Quiet out here again, I reckon. He touched his hat brim and nudged his horse back down the trail. Silas closed the door slowly, the latch clicking softly. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood for a moment, absorbing the silence. The immediate danger had passed. Truly passed. He turned back to the room. Eli and Evie were awake now, sitting up, wide-eyed, having heard Henderson's news. Evie scrambled up and ran to Clara's side, burying her face in the blanket. Eli stood, looking at Silas, a question in his young eyes. Silas walked to the table. He took out the signet ring, the heavy gold cold in his palm, the unfamiliar crest catching the light from the stove. Proof that had cost Jed Vance's life, Clara her health, and the twins their innocence. Proof that was now obsolete. The monster it was meant to expose was already dead. He looked at it for a long moment, then walked to the stove. He lifted the heavy iron lid, revealing the glowing coals beneath. He held the ring over the heat, feeling the metal warm rapidly. Then, without ceremony, he dropped it into the heart of the fire. It landed with a soft clink, immediately blackening, the intricate crest blurring, melting, consumed by the cleansing flames. It was no longer a weapon. It was just metal returning to the earth. Justice had come, swift and brutal, but not through this gilded symbol. Its purpose was served. He replaced the lid. The smell of hot metal briefly overlaid the sense of wood smoke and sickness. He turned back to the room. Clara watched him, understanding in her weary eyes. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, fleeting but real. Eli stared at the stove, then back at Silas, a new, complex expression on his young face. Not just fear, not just relief, but something akin to awe. Silas moved to the cot. He didn't sit. He stood beside it, looking down at Clara, then at Evie curled beside her, then at Eli standing watchfully near the foot. The silence settled again, deep and profound. But it wasn't the crushing silence of loneliness anymore. It was the quiet hum of a hearth holding against the wilderness, the fragile peace after the storm. It was the sound of breath drawn without fear, of wounds beginning to heal, of a space no longer empty. He walked to the door, not to watch for threats, but to look out at his land. The muddy trail, the wind-swept pines, the gray sky promising snow. The wilderness was still vast, still indifferent. But within the weathered walls of the cabin, life had taken root again. It was messy, born of violence and desperation. It was fragile, like Clara's recovery. But it was there. He didn't know what came next. Bitter Creek? A new start? The ranch felt different now, imbued with the echoes of children's whispers and a woman's quiet strength. The ghosts of the past hadn't vanished. Martha's presence was a gentle ache in the corner of his heart. But the future, for the first time in 5 long years, wasn't an endless, silent stretch of solitary days. It was a question mark filled with the daunting, necessary work of tending to life, the herd, the land, and the unexpected family sheltered within his walls. Silas Thorne took a deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air. He didn't crave the oblivion of undisturbed sleep anymore. He turned away from the vista of solitude and stepped back into the warm, crowded, imperfect sanctuary of his cabin, closing the door softly on the Wyoming wind. The silence inside was no longer his enemy. It was simply the space between heartbeats, waiting to be filled.